The road stretched ahead like a faded ribbon thrown across the plains, pale and endless under a cold autumn sky. Wind moved through the dry grass in long sighs, bending the earth into waves of dust and whisper. Nothing grew tall out here except loneliness. Fences were rare, trees even rarer, and the distances between one roof and the next could swallow a person whole. The widow walked slowly along that road, one hand gripping the hand of her little boy, the other holding the sleeve of her daughter so the child would not stumble in the ruts. Her boots were worn thin at the soles, and every few steps, dust slipped in through the cracks and rubbed her skin raw. She did not complain. She had not complained in a long time. Complaining was for people who still believed someone might hear them. Her dress had once been blue, prairie cotton, simple with small white buttons, but the sun and years had drained it into a tired gray. A brown shawl rested over her shoulders, patched at one corner, and her hair, once carefully kept, was now tied back loosely, strands falling across her face, moving in the wind. Her face was young, but hunger and worry had carved shadows beneath her eyes that did not belong on a woman her age. The boy walked quietly, like a child who had already learned that asking for things did not make them appear. He kicked a small stone as he walked, watching it roll ahead of him in the dust. The little girl held a piece of cloth, a rag that used to be part of her mother's apron, and dragged it softly as she walked, her steps uneven with tiredness. They had not eaten since the previous morning. Before that, only a piece of bread. Before that, she tried not to remember. The wind grew colder as the sun lowered, and the widow pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, then bent slightly and pulled her daughter closer to her side, wrapping part of the shawl around the child too. The boy said nothing, but she saw him shiver and pretend he hadn't. "We're almost there," she said softly. She had been saying that for miles, but this time it might be true. Somewhere beyond the low rise ahead, there was supposed to be a small ranch. Not a big place, not a rich place, just a few cattle, a small house, a barn that leaned a little to the left, and a man who lived alone and sometimes hired help when he could afford it. That was what the woman at the church had told her 3 days ago, when the widow had come asking if there was any work left in town. "Try the ranch out past Miller's Crossing," the churchwoman had said. "Man out there's poor as dry soil, but he's known to be fair. Don't talk much. Keeps to himself. But he ain't a cruel man." Poor as dry soil. The widow had almost laughed when she heard that. Poor helping poor sounded like a story that ended badly. But poor people understood hunger. Rich people understood numbers. So she walked. As she walked now, her mind drifted back, as it often did, to the small house she once had. It had been nothing special, just 2 rooms, a small porch, and a piece of land that grew more weeds and crops, but it had been theirs. Her husband built the fence himself, 1 post at a time, hands blistered and smiling anyway. He used to come in at night, smelling of sweat, leather, and sun, and he would lift the boy into the air and pretend the girl was a sack of gold he had found in the fields. Then came the fever one summer, fast and hot. By the time the doctor arrived, the house already felt empty. 3 days later, she was a widow at an age when she still felt like a new bride. After that, the land did not stay theirs for long. There were papers she did not understand, numbers she could not argue with, and men who spoke politely while taking everything. She tried to keep the house by sewing, washing clothes for people in town, mending shirts, baking bread to sell. But autumn came early that year, and work disappeared like water in sand. Then the landlord came. He did not look her in the eyes when he told her she had to leave the room she was renting. He kept looking at the children instead. "I'm sorry," he said, but he still stood in the doorway until she packed. So she packed. A blanket, 2 dresses, a small tin cup, a photograph, a wooden toy horse. That was all that was left of her life. The wind pulled her back to the present. The boy stumbled slightly, and she tightened her grip on his hand. "Ma," he said quietly, not looking up, "are we going to work on a farm again?" "I hope so," she said. "Will there be food?" She swallowed before answering. Yes. Children believed what their mothers said. That was both a blessing and a cruelty. They reached the top of the low rise just as the sun began to sink into the land, turning the plains gold and copper. From the hill, she finally saw it. A small ranch, a thin line of fence, a small cabin with smoke coming from the chimney, a barn, a water trough, a few cattle in the distance, dark shapes moving slowly, a horse tied near the fence. It wasn't much, but it was something. The widow stopped walking for a moment, and her knees felt weak, not from the walk, but from the last piece of hope she had been carrying for days. She rested her hand on the boy's head and looked down at her children. Their faces were pale, lips dry, eyes too big for their thin faces. "We're here," she said softly. They walked down the hill slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if her body had waited until the end to finally admit how tired it was. By the time they reached the fence, her hands were trembling. The ranch was quiet except for the soft sound of a hammer striking wood somewhere behind the barn. She opened the small gate and walked in. The children stayed close to her dress. She could hear her own heartbeat loud and fast, like she had run all the way there instead of walked for days. When she reached the side of the barn, she saw him. The rancher stood near a fence post, hammer in hand, fixing a broken rail. He wore a brown hat, a faded work shirt with sleeves rolled up, a worn vest, and old boots covered in dust. His face was weathered, not old but marked by sun and hard years. He worked slowly, carefully, like a man who fixed things because no one else would. He noticed them after a moment. He stopped hammering and straightened, resting the hammer against the post. For a few seconds, he just looked at them, the woman, the two children, the bundle in her hand, the dust on their clothes, the way the children held onto her like they were afraid the wind might take her away. He did not speak right away. Neither did she. She had practiced what to say 100 times while walking. "I'm looking for work. I can cook, clean, so wash anything. Just food, just a place in the barn. I'll work. I swear I'll work." But now that she stood in front of him, the words would not come out. Her throat felt tight, her head light. The world swayed slightly, and she realized she had not eaten enough to be standing this long. "Ma'am," the rancher said quietly. His voice was calm, not suspicious, not unkind, just careful. She tried to speak. I heard you might." Her voice broke. She hated that it broke. She tried again, but the words tangled with the shame in her chest, and suddenly she could not stand anymore. Not with the children looking at her, not with the man waiting, not with the weight of the last year pressing down on her shoulders. Before she even realized what she was doing, her knees gave out, and she fell onto the dirt in front of him. The children grabbed her dress, frightened. She did not cry loudly. The tears just came silently falling into the dust. "I have nothing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No money, no place. I can work, I can do anything, but please." She pulled the children gently forward, her hands shaking. "Take my children," she whispered. "They're good. They're strong. They'll work. Just feed them. Please just feed them." The words hung in the air, thin and fragile as thread. The rancher did not move for a long moment. He looked at the children. The boy tried to stand straight like a man, even though he was so thin the wind could have pushed him over. The little girl hid partly behind her mother, holding the torn piece of cloth and staring up with wide, silent eyes. Then the rancher looked at the woman, still on her knees in the dust, shoulders shaking, hands empty. He took a slow breath, then set the hammer down on the fence post. He walked toward them and stopped a few feet away. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady. "Ma'am," he said, "I ain't taking your children." For a second, she felt the world collapse. She lowered her head, nodded once, and tried to push herself up from the ground. Then he spoke again. "I'll take you too." She looked up at him, not understanding. He shifted his hat slightly, almost uncomfortable, then gestured toward the small cabin. "There's food inside," he said, "and it's getting cold. You and the young uns can come in. We'll figure the rest out after you've eaten." The widow did not move right away. She just stared at him, like she was trying to make sure he was real. Out on the empty plains, with winter coming and nothing left in the world, a door had opened. And sometimes in the Wild West, that was the difference between life and disappearing forever into the dust. Winter did not arrive all at once on the plains. It came in thin breaths at first, cold mornings, longer nights, frost clinging to the fence rails like a warning. Then, one morning the ground froze hard, the wind sharpened, and the world turned quiet and white and difficult. By then, the widow and her children had been at the ranch for several weeks. The first night, the rancher gave them the cabin and slept in the barn without saying a word about it. She discovered it at dawn when she woke and found his bedroll untouched near the wall. She stepped outside into the cold morning and saw him already working, carrying a bucket from the well, as if he had always slept under a roof of rough wooden beams and the warm breath of cattle. That morning she tried to thank him, but he only nodded once and said, "There's oats in the sack by the stove. Kids should eat while it's hot." He was not a man of many words, but he noticed everything. From that day on, she worked. She woke before sunrise and lit the stove, cooked what little they had, oats, sometimes beans, sometimes a small piece of salt pork, when there was any. She cleaned the cabin, washed clothes in cold water that turned her hands red and raw, mended his shirts, patched the children's clothes, swept the floor, carried water, gathered the few eggs the chickens gave, and learned how to stretch every piece of food so that no one went to sleep hungry. She never asked for rest. She never asked for anything at all. The ranch was small and poor, but it was alive. There were a few cattle that needed feeding, fences that needed mending, a horse that needed brushing, wood that needed chopping, and 100 small things that could not be ignored if a place like this was going to survive the winter. The children slowly began to change. The boy's shoulders straightened after the first week of regular meals. He started following the rancher around like a quiet shadow, carrying small tools, holding nails, trying to lift things that were too heavy for him. The rancher never laughed at him for trying. He just showed him how to hold a hammer properly, how to tie a rope, how to move slowly around cattle, so they didn't spook. The little girl stayed close to the cabin at first, sitting near the stove, watching her mother cook or sew. But after some time, she began to smile again, small smiles at first, then laughter when the rancher once tried to fix a chair, and it collapsed under him, sending him to the floor in a cloud of dust. He looked so surprised that the girl laughed, so hard she had to hold her stomach, and even the widow covered her mouth to hide a smile. It had been a long time since laughter lived in her chest. The rancher remained careful with them, as if he understood that people who had lost everything could be frightened by sudden kindness. He knocked on the cabin door before entering, even though it was his own house. He never sat too close, never asked questions she did not offer answers to. Many evenings he ate quickly and then said he had work in the barn, leaving her and the children by the fire where it was warm. Respect, she realized, could feel a lot like safety. But the world outside the ranch did not forget them. When she went into town once every 2 weeks with the rancher to buy flour, sugar, coffee, and lamp oil, she began to notice the looks. Women in the general store would glance at her, then at the rancher, then whisper to each other behind their hands. Men at the saloon porch would tilt their chairs back and watch them pass with slow, knowing expressions. A man living with a widow, she once overheard. Poor man finally found himself a woman to cook for him, another said with a laugh. She kept her eyes down and said nothing. The rancher said nothing either, but she noticed his jaw tighten slightly when they walked past the saloon. One afternoon, as winter settled deeper and the sky hung low and gray, a rider came to the ranch. He was well dressed for a man in that part of the country, clean coat, good hat, polished boots, and a horse that had never known hunger. He did not dismount right away, just sat tall in the saddle and looked around the ranch like a man measuring something he might buy. The widow was hanging laundry when he arrived. The rancher was repairing a fence rail. "You the owner here?" the rider asked. "I am," the rancher replied, not stopping his work. The rider introduced himself as a landowner from near the river, a man who owned more cattle than could be counted from one hill. He spoke politely, but everything about him felt like a man who was used to getting what he wanted. "Land like this will be worth something one day," he said, looking toward the well. "Water nearby. Good grazing. I could make you an offer." "Ain't looking to sell?" the rancher said, simply. The man smiled, but it was a thin smile. "Everyone's looking to sell. Just depends on the number." "Not me." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "If you change your mind, I'll be back through before spring." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a trail of dark hoof prints in the thin snow. That evening, the widow noticed the rancher sitting quietly at the table long after the children had gone to sleep. He was looking at a small stack of papers, turning them over slowly, his face unreadable. "Is something wrong?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then said, "Just taxes. Winter's expensive. Always is." She wanted to ask more, but his eyes had that distant look of a man carrying a weight he did not plan to share. So she only nodded and placed a cup of coffee near his hand before returning to her sewing. Winter grew colder. Then one night the boy became sick. It started with a cough, then a fever that came fast and hot. By midnight, the child was burning and shivering at the same time, his small hands gripping the blanket, his breathing uneven. The widow sat beside the bed, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, whispering soft words, but fear had already begun to rise in her chest like floodwater. "We need a doctor," she said quietly. The rancher looked out the window. Snow was falling hard, the wind pushing it sideways across the land in white sheets. "Town's near 10 miles, he said. She did not answer. She just looked at her son. The rancher stood there for a long moment, then reached for his coat and hat. "I'll bring the doctor," he said. "You can't ride in that," she said quickly. "You'll freeze before you reach the road." He paused at the door, then said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "Boy needs a doctor," he said simply. "That's all there is to it." He saddled the horse in the dark while the wind howled across the ranch, then rode out into the snow, disappearing into the white night. The widow did not sleep. She sat beside her son, listening to the wind, counting minutes, praying in whispers she had not spoken since her husband died. Just before dawn, she heard hoofbeats. The rancher returned with the doctor. Both men covered in snow, faces red from the cold. The doctor gave the boy medicine, said it was a winter fever and that he would likely recover now that the fever had been broken in time. After the doctor left, the rancher went to the barn without a word. She followed a few minutes later and found him sitting on a wooden crate, head lowered, hands still shaking slightly from the cold ride. "You could have died," she said quietly. He shrugged a little, not looking at her. "Kids shouldn't be buried in winter," he said. "Ground's too hard." She felt something break and mend inside her at the same time when he said that. No one had ever ridden into a storm for her children before. No one had ever risked anything for them except her. From that day on, something changed between them, not spoken, not named, but understood. They were no longer a rancher and a widow who happened to share a roof. They were something closer to a family, though none of them had said the word yet. Outside, the snow continued to fall across the wide, wild west, covering the dry land in white, as if the world were quietly giving them a chance to begin again. Winter began to loosen its grip slowly, like a tired hand releasing the land. Snow melted into dark earth. The creek began to move again, and the cattle lifted their heads to the smell of wet grass pushing up through the soil. Spring on the frontier never arrived in a single moment. It came in small mercies. By then, the ranch no longer felt like a place where the widow and her children were staying. It felt like a place where they belonged. The boy had grown stronger over the winter. He could carry wood now, without dropping it, could help men fence, could even saddle the horse with only a little help. The little girl had claimed a corner of the cabin near the window where she kept a few small treasures. A smooth stone, a ribbon her mother found in town, and the wooden toy horse her father had carved long ago. The widow moved through the cabin like she had always lived there, her hands knowing where everything belonged, her voice filling the quiet evenings, her presence turning the small, rough cabin into something warmer than wood and nails. And the rancher, he had changed too, though in quieter ways. He talked a little more at supper. Sometimes he even smiled, small and quick, like a man who wasn't used to smiling but was learning how again. But trouble has a way of finding peaceful places. One afternoon, when the ground was still soft from melted snow, the wealthy landowner returned. This time he did not come alone. Another man rode with him, thin, wearing a dark coat, and carrying a leather folder under his arm. They dismounted near the fence, their boots too clean for men who worked the land. The widow saw them from the cabin window and felt a tightness in her chest before a single word was spoken. The rancher walked out to meet them, wiping his hands slowly on a cloth. After noon, the wealthy man said, "Told you I'd be back before spring." "I remember," the rancher replied. The thin man opened the leather folder and pulled out several papers. "There seems to be a matter regarding this land," he said. "Unpaid taxes from previous years. A filing error. These things happen." The rancher took the papers and looked at them, his face still and hard to read. "What it comes down to," the wealthy man said calmly, "is that the debt needs to be paid in full, or the land transfers to the claimant." "Claimant being you," the rancher said. The man smiled slightly. "I am a reasonable man. I would still be willing to buy the land from you. That way you walk away with something in your pocket, instead of nothing at all." The wind moved through the open land, rattling the loose fence wire. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, the rancher handed the papers back. "I'll settle the debt," he said. "With what?" the wealthy man asked, looking around at the small ranch, the thin cattle, the worn barn. "You barely made it through winter." The rancher did not answer. The men mounted their horses again. "You have until the end of the month," the wealthy man said. "After that, the land won't be yours to stand on." They rode away, leaving the ranch quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. A heavy quiet. That night, after the children were asleep, the widow saw the rancher sitting at the table again, the same way he had sat earlier in the winter, papers spread in front of him, a pencil in his rough hand, numbers written and crossed out again and again. "You're going to sell the cattle," she said quietly from the doorway. He looked up, slightly surprised. Then he nodded once. "And the horse? You won't be able to run the ranch without a horse." "Won't have a ranch if I don't pay the debt." She stood there for a long moment, her hands tightening slightly in her apron. "We'll leave," she said. He looked up sharply. "No, you took us in when we had nothing," she continued, her voice steady but soft. "Fed us all winter. Risked your life for my boy. We won't be the reason you lose your land." "You ain't the reason," he said firmly. "But we are another mouth to feed. 3 more, actually." "That ain't how I see it." She swallowed, her eyes beginning to shine. "This place was yours before we came. It should still be yours when we go." He pushed his chair back and stood up, running a hand over the back of his neck like a man, trying to find the right words in a language he did not speak well. "You think I took you in out of charity?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer. He looked down at the table for a moment, then spoke again, slower this time. "I took you in because no one should have to choose between starving and giving their children away. And somewhere along the way, this place started feeling less empty." The words hung in the air between them, but she still shook her head slightly. "We'll leave before the end of the month," she said. "That way you can sell what you need without worrying about us." She turned away quickly so he would not see the tears in her eyes. She planned to leave at sunrise 2 days later. She packed the same way she had packed the last time she lost everything: a blanket, 2 dresses, a tin cup, the photograph, the wooden toy horse. The children did not fully understand, but they could feel the sadness in the air and stayed very close to her, quiet and watchful. Just as the sun began to rise and paint the land in pale gold, she stepped off the cabin porch with the children beside her. She had only taken a few steps when she heard his voice behind her. "You planning on leaving without saying goodbye?" She turned slowly. He was standing near the fence, hat in his hands, like a man standing in front of a church, not sure if he should go in. "We didn't want to make it harder," she said. He walked toward them slowly, then stopped a few feet away, looking at the children, then at her. "I went to town yesterday," he said. She felt her heart tighten. "To sell the horse?" "No," he said. "To talk to the sheriff. And the county clerk." She frowned slightly, not understanding. He held up a folded paper. "Turns out the tax claim was filed wrong. Landowner was trying to push it through before anyone noticed. Sheriff says the land's still mine. Always was." For a moment, she could not speak. The children looked between them, confused but sensing something important had just happened. "So, you don't have to leave," he said, his voice quieter now. She looked down at the ground, then back at him. "We can't just stay forever," she said softly. "People will talk. And this is your ranch, not ours." He shifted his weight slightly, clearly uncomfortable, like a man about to step into deep water. "This place," he began, then stopped and tried again. "This place has got room. More room than one man needs. And the boy's already better at fixing fence than I was at his age. Little one laughs at my bad jokes, even when they ain't funny. And you," he paused, searching for the right words, "you made this place feel like a home instead of a shack where a man sleeps." She felt tears slide down her face, but she did not wipe them away. He looked at the ground, then back at her, his voice low and honest. "I ain't good with fancy words. But if you and the young uns wanted to stay, not as workers, not as charity, as family, I'd be honored by it." The wind moved softly through the new spring grass around them. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then the little girl let go of her mother's hand and ran to the rancher, wrapping her small arms around his leg like she had done it 100 times before. The boy walked more slowly, trying to act older than he was, but he stopped beside a rancher and stood close. The widow looked at the three of them standing there in the morning light, this quiet, kind man and her children who were no longer thin and frightened but alive and safe. She stepped closer. "You once told me no one should have to choose between starving and giving their children away," she said softly. "I think no one should have to live their whole life alone either." He nodded once, his eyes bright but his voice steady. "That's true." She took a breath, then said the words that would change all their lives. "Then we'll stay," she said. Spring settled fully over the ranch in the weeks that followed. The widow made curtains from old flour sacks. The boy helped build a stronger fence. The little girl planted flowers near the cabin. The rancher worked the land with a kind of quiet determination that comes from knowing you are no longer working just to survive. You are working for people who are waiting for you at the supper table. One evening, after a long day, the widow walked out to the field carrying a tin cup of water. The rancher was repairing a section of fence, the sun setting behind him, turning the whole land gold. She handed him the cup. Their fingers brushed slightly, and neither of them pulled away too quickly this time. They stood side by side, looking out over the small ranch, the barn, the cabin, the thin line of fence, the children playing near the well, their laughter carrying across the warm evening air. Months ago, she had fallen to her knees in the dust with nothing left in the world. Now she stood on the same kind of land, but everything had changed. Not because someone had rescued her, but because, in a hard and lonely land, two broken lives had chosen to build something together. And that was how families were sometimes made in the Wild West. Not by blood, but by kindness, sacrifice, and the simple, powerful decision to stay.